One of the most difficult things to deliver in gaming is a game that is meant to scare or shock the player, and when the whole game is based around that premise, such as the case with horror titles, then it can often be the difference between a memorable experience or one that's remembered for all the wrong reasons. When SuperMassive Games released Until Dawn back in 2015, it delivered a classic teen horror game filled with cliches which rewarded multiple playthroughs, making different choices and seeing what the outcome would be and how it would differ to the previous playthrough. Now we have the Dark Pictures' Man of Medan, and those expecting it to match what Until Dawn delivered may be disappointed. Even with its more budget-friendly price tag, it straddles the line between something that is genuinely good, but also fails in several areas which are of such importance. I was extremely critical of Layers of Fear 2 after its impressive first outing, and Man of Medan stumbles in some of the same areas, but also manages to deliver in others. So is Man of Medan worthy of a purchase with its cheaper price tag? The game follows Alex, Brad, Julia, Conrad and Fliss, who is the captain of the boat, as they plan to go on a diving expedition in where they hope to find the wreck of a World War II plane. As a rough storm begins to approach, our characters find themselves aboard a ghost ship where events begin to transpire, which may see some of these characters not make it off the ship alive. Once they're aboard the ship, this is where the game really begins and players start to make choices which will impact that character or somebody else in either positive or negative ways. You'll be taking control of each of the characters at various times throughout the game. This will either have you take control of one member within the group or an individual on their own. Whoever you're controlling, the path through the ship is fairly straightforward, but players are also able to enter different rooms to collect items, which will offer a little more information about the ship's history. But all of it is very simplistic and doesn't really add anything extra to what is already there. As the game plays out, our characters will become more endangered by what's happening around them, plus they will also suffer from what appears to be hallucinations, ghost sightings, and other strange or paranormal goings on. And as the game continues, players will see these events manifest themselves several times. One area which was a good addition, even though it could have been taken further, was that of the relationship between the characters, which sees Alex and Brad be brothers, Julia being the girlfriend of Alex, whilst Conrad is the brother of Julia. On one hand, this makes the group more interesting than all of them simply being friends, but the game never really goes anywhere far enough in exploring the relationships between the characters, nor does it use them for any really interesting scenarios that play out. Done differently, this could have injected some real emotion while still retaining that classic teen horror feel. Just as Until Dawn revels in its cliched settings of the lodge in the woods, Man of Medan uses the classic ghost ship setting with the event of a storm approaching. Ghost ships and horror stories being played out during thunderstorms is nothing original, but it all depends on how they are used to provide a satisfactory story, and in this case, a fun game. Until Dawn created a tense atmosphere and a real sense of isolation for its characters, and it succeeded in conveying that to the player. Even though it was riddled with cliches and teen horror movie tropes, it delivered on what it set out to achieve, and it looked very impressive, as it still does today. Now visually, Man of Medan gets a lot right, and it all works to create a cohesive whole for this game. From its widescreen presentation to its dimly lit hallways, it all looks very good, even though there were a few times I came into contact with some very low resolution textures. These stood out more, as at one part I saw this scene, which looked great, but then only moments later I was staring into this blurry and low detailed mess of a boat. At the beginning of the game, we see some more open shots of the boat on the ocean, or when they're docked at the wharf before leaving, and this was a nice touch considering the rest of the game has a much more claustrophobic feel whilst aboard the ship. The water effects and use of sunlight again just give a great look to the game when we will be so confined in so much artificial light and darkness later on. Once aboard the ghost ship, the environment also looks good, but there is really only so much variety that can be had on a World War II ship in such darkness. You'll be going through plenty of doors, down a lot of darkened hallways, which will often open into larger rooms, but not many that will knock you out with their use of colour and difference in design. The game is set upon this ship, and in that, it delivers on what you would expect to see. In terms of the characters themselves, each has been motion captured, and they do have that Until Dawn look about them. When walking around the environments, I found the characters' movement to go from incredibly believable to quite stilted and unnatural. Oftentimes they will slightly crouch when they're apprehensive about an area or moving forward, or seeing them look around, surveying their surroundings, and it was these little touches that made things more believable. Even watching them swim and move underwater, it was believable and made me forget about any issues and just focus on that scene itself. But then we get to the other side of the equation, whereby the immersion can become broken. Moving the characters around can sometimes feel very sluggish in anything but simply walking forward, and when you combine this with the tight spaces of the ship, I would often get caught on the environment. The set camera angle can also prove a problem sometimes, where I misjudged where objects were in relation to my character. Not a huge problem, but enough for it to take away from the experience somewhat. Just as other similar games, players will be interacting with objects by picking them up and rotating them. These moments are what you have come to know from other games, whereby the motion of picking up the object and moving it around is smooth once you have it, but also stilted when watching the hands of the character waiting for input from the player. Those familiar with Until Dawn will probably already know that Man of Medan will be presenting players with many cutscenes and movie sequences to progress the story along and to move between the different areas of the game, and it's in these sequences where players get their best look at the character faces and models. For me, this is the most important part of the visuals and presentation, as much of the emotion associated with what the characters are going through are of course going to be conveyed through their facial animations. Apart from sometimes having a slight plastic look about their skin tone, the movement on the character faces is more than adequate, and SuperMassive Games have done a good job with them. The movement of the character mouths, and especially their eyes, all move with subtlety when needed, or much more varied movement when required to. There are a few times when character faces seem to contort in a rather odd way, which broke the realism, but overall I was impressed with them, especially for a less expensive game. When it comes to facial movement, I put a lot of significance on the movement of the character's eyes, as nothing breaks my immersion factor more than a face and mouth that move somewhat realistically, but then the eyes barely have any life about them. They need to move subtly and convey the emotion or state that the character is in, and Man of Medan does this quite well, even though facial animation isn't perfect, as I mentioned earlier. Each actor does a good job with the script they've been given, and they deliver their lines well to make these characters believable. There is an attempt at humour several times during the game, but this can be quite hit or miss. Overall though, I didn't have a problem with the acting or the writing, nor do I expect the best of this in a horror game. One issue I did find with several of the cutscenes were the very quick loads in the middle of them before going to the next shot. At first, I thought the game was going to an entirely different scene, but then the same one would continue. It's a little jarring and breaks up what's been shown for no reason. But all of what I've spoken about so far, it all needs to come together to deliver what the developers require, and that's in delivering a tense, atmospheric, and hopefully a scary game. Even though I found the story adequate and wanted to know how things would play out, and the characters were solid enough to relate to, I can't say that the game was scary at all or even tense. Several times during Until Dawn, I felt they used the environment and darkness to create a tension and sense of fear that is lacking in Man of Medan. Being set on a ghost ship, it's no surprise that the characters may see certain things at times, but whenever this would happen, it was never scary, and in a game where this is such an important part of the experience, it can only let the overall product down, and it does. It became another story-driven game, but lacked enough depth to that story and characters to succeed enough just as that. I'm not one that is easily scared in games, and I found Layers of Fear 2 such a letdown in this department as well. Both these games lack the subtlety and tense atmosphere of the first Layers of Fear, for example. A part of what made that game a success in my eyes was the subtle use of sound when needed, but then really put the musical sound effects front and center to create the atmosphere or dread, and this is where Man of Medan doesn't get the balance right. It certainly has some classic jump scare moments, but even these fall flat, and a couple of them were just there to simply inject some scares without really fitting in. This isn't only a criticism of this game, but if the player isn't on edge already, then these will always fall flat, but this is where these games need to succeed the most. Throughout my playtime, I kept wanting to have more sound from the game as a whole, especially since I was wearing headphones and I wanted to be totally caught up in this game. But for a game set on this old ship, I would expect to hear a lot more sounds coming from it, whether it was hearing the ship creaking as the steel twisted and contorted, or other atmospheric sounds from blocked or dripping pipes. But there isn't a whole lot going on in this department. If gamers are going to put down their money with the knowledge they are buying a horror experience, then that is what they need to receive. And because Man of Medan does not offer that, then I can't really recommend it on that basis. The game is roughly 4 to 6 hours long, depending whether you explore every area, and I wouldn't want the game to drag on any longer and overstay its welcome. The pacing of the game could have used some improvement though, as considering it is a shorter game, the first hour drags on, whereby it focuses on the characters on their boat when they are getting ready to embark to the site of the plane wreck. This had some unnecessary gameplay segments, which really did nothing more than pad the game out, but in the wrong area. If it's meant to be a scary game, then offer more of those moments instead. This wouldn't be as bad if the characters and their relationships were fleshed out more or were deeper, as mentioned before, but they really aren't, so I feel the time would have been better spent elsewhere. But seeing as these issues do exist, I don't feel any need to go back and replay the game again, choosing different dialogue actions to see if I could save other characters, or making my existing survivors meet their death. These issues don't make Man of Medan a bad game, it just doesn't make it a scary one, and that's what it is needing to be. The characters, setting and length of the game kept my interest, and this works in the game's favour as opposed to Layers of Fear 2, which also wasn't scary and was much too long. But whereas that game was a very lonely experience when moving around the ship, Man of Medan keeps things more interesting because of its different characters and being able to take control of them. Until Dawn was a more memorable experience, and the deaths of the characters really played to the strengths of the teen horror genre. But 4 years on, more was needed to be done with Man of Medan to take that formula and bring it up to the next level, but most importantly, make it succeed in the most important areas, and that's to be scary and warrant multiple playthroughs. Without these, I fear that Man of Medan will be remembered for the missed opportunities, the most prominent being, why not just give anxious gamers a sequel to Until Dawn instead?